Thank you, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be back in Oxford. I appreciate that nice introduction. I should tell you, however, that I quickly learned not to pay too much attention to nice introductions because I have 3 sons, and when people would call our house and they'd say, "Is Dr. Nye there?" they'd always reply, "Yes, but he's not the useful kind." And as about being back in Oxford, somebody said as I walked in, "Oh, you should have been here yesterday. It was so bright and sunny." And I said, "Well, no, actually, I prefer today. It makes me feel more normal." One year in Hillary term, kept a record of how many days you could go in Oxford without seeing the sun. I got up to 20. Maybe some of you have broken that record. In any case, what I'd like to talk to you about this morning is the future of power, what the world is going to be like that you'll see in the next couple of decades. It's the theme of the book that Lindsay mentioned that I've just done, in which I try to ask, how can we understand the way power is shifting in the world? And I think the one way to think about it is there are 2 great power shifts going on in the beginning of the 20th century as a result of globalization and the information revolution. One I call power transition from one set of states to another, which is largely a shift from west to east. The other is power diffusion away from states and governments to non-state and non-governmental actors. Let me quickly identify each of those and then come back to how they can be put together. Power transition perhaps can be best understood by imagining that you took a snapshot of the world in 1800. You would see that more than half the world's population was in Asia, and more than half of what the world produced was in Asia. Now, fast forward to 1900, Asia is still more than half the world's population, but only 20% of the world's product. That's not something that happened to Asia, it's something that happened to Europe and North America, the Industrial Revolution. And what we're seeing in this century is what I call the recovery of Asia, or if you want, the return to normal proportions. Sometime around the middle of this century, Asia will be again half the world's population and half the world's product. This starts with Japan, moves on to Korea, then to some Southeast Asian countries like Singapore, Malaysia. Now very much focused on China, with China's impressive 10% growth rates, but soon we'll be focusing very much on India, which is now reaching growth rates in the range of 8–9% as well. This is a huge shift of power. Let me come back to that, but let me ask you to hold that in your minds for a moment while I turn to the other great power shift, which is power diffusion. Power transition among states we're more familiar with. It's happened before. Power diffusion, no. This is new. And the way to get your mind wrapped around power diffusion is to think about the extraordinary progress of the current information revolution that we're undergoing. If you looked at the last quarter of the 20th century, you'd see that the price of computing power declined 1,000-fold. Now, that's such a large abstract number, it's hard to wrap your mind around it. But imagine if the price of an automobile had declined as rapidly as the price of computing power. You could buy a car today for £5. That's quite remarkable. What this means is whenever the price of something goes down that dramatically, the barriers to entry go down. Those who were previously priced out of the market or priced out of participation can now participate. Let me give you some examples. If in 1975, you had wanted to communicate from Oxford to Johannesburg to Wellington, New Zealand, to Moscow and Washington, D.C. simultaneously. You could do it. Technically, there was no great trick to it, but it was very expensive. And therefore, you needed to have a big budget, like a corporation or a government, to be able to do it. Today, any of you can do that free on Skype. Or to give you another example, when I was in the Carter administration dealing with the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, one of our greatest secrets was that we could take a picture of any place on Earth with 1 meter resolution. That cost us billions and billions of dollars. Today, anybody can get a better picture on Google Earth for free. This is an extraordinary reduction of barriers to entry into playing a role in world politics. It doesn't mean, as some people put it, that the nation state is over or governments no longer matter. Governments are indeed better endowed with power resources than most other actors overall. However, it does mean that the stage on which governments act is now much more crowded, and that leads to a very different type of politics. Some of these new actors that are enabled are good to evaluate them, some of them are bad. Oxfam is good. The Gates Foundation is good, probably does more good for malaria in Africa than the US government does. Other actors are bad. I would put Al-Qaeda in that category. And it's worth noticing that Al-Qaeda, enabled with technologies, was able to kill more Americans on September 11th, 2001 than the government of Japan did in its attack at Pearl Harbor in 1941. You might consider this the privatization of war. That's new. Other actors are also enabled by information technology. Multinational corporations have been around for a long time, but the span of control that multinationals now have, enabled by information technology, is really quite remarkable and quite new. Or if you want to take another example of the way the diffusion of power has affected politics and transformed it, think of recent events in the Middle East. The conventional wisdom a decade or two ago about, let's say, Egypt was you had no middle. There was the autocrat Mubarak on one side and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other extreme, nothing in between. But this burgeoning information technology created that new middle that you saw in Tahrir Square. And what's more, it gave them techniques to overcome the problems of collective action and coordinate with each other, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth. That has not produced democracy in Egypt. We're in the first act of a multi-act play. But it has transformed the whole politics. What you're seeing is no longer just a two-party game between the military with its hard power and the Muslim Brotherhood with a religious soft power. There's now also a secular soft power in the middle, and it's a three-party game. Or give you another example, think of WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks represented the theft of 250,000 classified State Department cables, which were then distributed around the world. Stealing documents from other governments is not new. Many a good spy has walked out of a foreign ministry with a briefcase full of secret documents. But the idea of being exfiltrate a warehouse full of secret documents on a Lady Gaga disc and distribute them around the world, that is new. That difference in quantity is a difference in quality. Or finally, to illustrate these changes that information technology has produced in empowering individuals and accelerating this diffusion of power, think of the problem of cybersecurity, an issue which is now getting much more attention. For example, when I was at the Munich Security Conference, which is held every year in Munich, David Cameron and William Hague came and spoke. And what's interesting is that both of them spent a great deal of their time in their addresses on cybersecurity. But do we know what we're doing in cybersecurity? Not. I don't know how many of you have seen a reproduction of a wonderful cartoon that was in the New Yorker magazine some years ago. And it had a picture of a computer and two dogs sitting in front of the computer. And one dog looks at the other dog and says, "Don't worry, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." That was not only a good cartoon, it was politically prescient. Because if you notice the recent Stuxnet worm, which caused some Iranian nuclear centrifuges to shake themselves to death, at some point, that type of attack could be done back against us. You might lose all electricity in the southern half of Britain, or the whole northeast of the United States might go dark and cold when the degrees are such that the pipes freeze. And we wouldn't know for sure who did it. It could be another government. It could be a group of hackers. It could be a criminal gang. It could be cyber terrorists. The one thing we will know is that whoever did it would be smart enough to have routed it through servers which looked like somebody else did it. So if you ask, how can I reply to this enormous damage that was done to me, and you say, well, it came from a server in Moscow or Beijing, you can almost be sure that's not where it came from. What does this do to our concepts of strategy? What is deterrence? What is offense? What is defense? When you don't know whether it's a non-state actor or a state actor, and it's all mixed up through electrons crossing borders. That indeed is a new type of politics, and we really haven't begun to wrap our minds around this. I've sometimes argued, I use an analogy in this new book in which I say, in the realm of cyber, we are about where people in nuclear weaponry were in 1950. We just haven't thought our way through this. That then leads me to the question of how do we think about this? And one of the problems we have is we don't think about it in very clear terms. We're stuck with very old-fashioned ideas of what power is. When I was a student here, I used to listen to the lectures of the great Oxford historian A.J.P. Taylor. And Taylor, who wrote a wonderful book called The Struggle for the Mastery of Europe, defined a great power as a country able to prevail in war. But think about that for a minute. In an information age, it may sometimes be as important whose story wins as whose army wins. And this inability that we have to adjust our thinking to broader concepts of power often limits our policy and our types of responses. Power, in the way I use the term, is simply the ability to affect others to get the outcomes you want. Now, you can do that in three ways. You can do it with threats of coercion, sticks. You can do it with payments, carrots. Or you can do it with attraction and persuasion to get others to want what you want. That's what I call soft power. If others want what you want, you can save a lot on carrots and sticks. And yet when we think of responses or think about how we invest in power, we tend to think very much in A.J.P. Taylor's terms. It's still very much the old-fashioned coercive or perhaps payment, and we don't place enough emphasis on all the aspects of power, including soft power. Now, I'm not arguing that soft power can replace hard power. It can't. Hard power remains important. But the ability to combine hard and soft power into what I've called smart power, successful strategies using all dimensions of power, that's something we're going to need if we're going to cope with these enormous challenges that we face in the 21st century. And frankly, in our thinking about this, we're not there yet. Now, let me go back to this question of power transition that I asked you to set aside and think about. I said power transition was a shift of power among states. States still remain important. But if you look at the power transition from west to east, very much now people are focusing it on China. The rise of China is quite remarkable, quite impressive. In the last 30 years, China has raised 400 million people out of poverty. This is a wonderful accomplishment. They're still several 100 million people to go, but we should be basically applauding this. But along with this great growth in power of Chinese economy, there are accompanying fears. What will China do with this? For example, China's growth rate in GDP is 10% a year, but its growth in military expenditure is 13%. So China is investing some of this in very traditional hard power. Now, that has led to a cottage industry, if you want, of trying to explain power transition in the 21st century as the old pattern of rise and fall. This is the rise of China and the decline of the United States. So we're constantly reading op-eds and editorials about American decline. I think this is wrong-headed. It's wrong-headed for several reasons. First of all, we don't know what the patterns of life cycles of countries are like. Human lives, yes, it's very clear. I can assure you I am in decline. But countries, no. It's worth remembering that Horace Walpole in the 18th century, after Britain had lost its North American colonies, said, "Woe is Britain. We are now reduced to a miserable little country like Sardinia or Denmark." Of course, he was on the eve of Britain's greatest century, fueled by the Industrial Revolution. So we have no idea where America is in its so-called life cycle. Some people like to use the metaphor of ancient Rome, and they say, you know, America is an empire which is declining like the Roman Empire. But aside from the fact that it took Rome about 3.5 centuries to accomplish its decline, there's also the question that the metaphor is quite incorrect. Rome was an agrarian society with no productivity growth in its economy, wrought by internecine warfare, and it eventually succumbed not to the rise of another country or empire, but to hordes of barbarians. When we think about the United States and where American power is in the world today, people talk about decline without distinguishing two different dimensions of the concept. One is absolute decline, the other is relative decline. Absolute decline is what I just described of ancient Rome. And for all the problems that the United States has, the current budget deficit is one that's achieving a great deal of press attention, and a serious problem, but a soluble one. But the current situation in the United States is not at all like ancient Rome. The World Economic Forum ranks the United States as the fourth most competitive economy in the world, behind Switzerland, Sweden, and Singapore. China, incidentally, is ranked number 27. If you look at new technologies, nanotechnology, biotechnology, which will be crucial in this century, Americans are generally seen at the forefront there. If you look at surveys of entrepreneurship, which countries have the most entrepreneurial climate, the United States often comes out top there as well. So this metaphor of absolute decline, which is so popular for editorialists and op-ed writers, is pretty shallow and not very relevant. However, relative decline is relevant. And relative decline means that the gap between the United States and rising countries is diminishing. If you think of the rise of China, India, Brazil, and others, there is a diminution of the gap between American power and the power of these emerging countries. So imagine that if the United States power position was here 20 years ago when the China, Brazil, India was here, as that gap closes, you can describe that as the rise of the rest. You can also disclose it or describe it as relative decline of the gap between the United States and others. Notice one thing, however, as the gap narrows and there's relative decline, doesn't necessarily mean that the other countries will pass the United States in overall power. Now, this is particularly important when we focus on the relationship with China, because part of this narrative, which I think is a misplaced narrative of rise and fall of powers and transition, is the old legend that goes back to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. Remember when Thucydides was trying to explain why did the Greek city-state system of the 5th century BC tear itself apart? He said it was caused by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. And many people say World War I, in which the European state system tore itself apart and ceased to be the center of world politics, was caused by the rise in the power of Germany and the fear that created in Britain. And then they go on and say that will be the legend of power transition or the narrative of power transition in the 21st century. The rise in the power of China and the fear it will create in the United States will create a great conflagration, which will mark this century. I don't agree with that. I think it's bad history and bad analysis. Bad history because by 1900, Germany had already passed Britain in its economic sway. If you look at the relationship of the United States and China, I don't see China passing the United States in the next few decades. Now people say, how can you say that? Goldman Sachs or Standard Chartered or somebody says that in another few years the Chinese economy will be as large as the American economy. That's true, but equivalence in size is not the same as equivalence in composition. If you measure the sophistication of an economy by per capita income, you'll see that China won't catch up to the United States for several decades, if then. Moreover, you have to look at other dimensions of power. Military power, China is indeed building an aircraft carrier this year. Long way to go between an aircraft carrier and 11 carrier battle groups. Or if you look at soft power, where China is indeed investing greatly in its soft power. Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress of China in the year 2007 that China needed to invest in soft power, and they have been spending billions and billions of dollars on Confucius Institutes, on trying to turn CCTV into a sort of a Chinese Al Jazeera, and so forth. But even here, China is having difficulty accomplishing this rise in its soft power that it aspires to with these investments. For example, China has a problem in unleashing the powers of its civil society. If you ask, where does American soft power come from? Not really from the government. It comes from civil society. Much more of American soft power is created by universities, foundations, Hollywood, not from government actions. In fact, sometimes those two run at cross purposes to each other. But if you look at China, China has a hard time unleashing the talents of its civil society because of its authoritarian system. So China will do something like the Shanghai Expo, which I visited last year, a wonderful exposition which makes you feel very good about China. But then it'll follow that by locking up Liu Xiaobo and preventing him going to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony and undercut that soft power which is creating. So I don't see China catching up with the US in soft power until you see a profound change in the nature of Chinese domestic political system which unleashes its civil society. So for all these reasons, I don't see this picture of China passing the US the way Germany passed Britain. Why is that important? Because it means there's time to react to the rise of China without exaggerated fears. Let me take you back to Thucydides. It was the rise in the power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta. The greatest danger we have is this narrative of decline, which leads to hubris in China and pressing too hard, and leads to fear in the United States, which leads us into the Thucydides trap. It's not necessary, but it's going to require careful analysis and understanding of power relations to avoid that sort of exaggerated fear. Now, let me take those 2 points about power transition and power diffusion and wrap them together in a conclusion for you. How then should you understand power and the distribution of power in this century? I've used the metaphor of a three-dimensional chess game. On the top board of military relations among states, the United States is the only superpower. It's about half of the world's military expenditure. It's the only country that can project military power globally. We call that a unipolar world. But go to the middle board of economic relations among states, and the world is multipolar. This is the area where Europe can act as an entity, and when it does, the European economy is larger than the American economy. So on the board of economic relations, Europe, China, Japan, Brazil, India, others can balance American power. Go to the bottom board, however, of transnational relations, things that cross borders outside the control of government, and this is where power diffusion comes in, and power is chaotically distributed. It makes no sense at all to take categories like unipolar or multipolar and apply them to this area. Those are category mistakes, taking something works in one realm and applying it to a realm where it doesn't work. And that means that the types of things that are occurring on this bottom board that are going to so profoundly affect your lives include financial flows that are larger than the budgets of many governments, include terrorist groups that can act using the internet across borders. It includes cyber terrorism, where the electrons flow and you don't know where they came from. It includes impersonal processes like climate change. It includes processes like pandemics, where, if you remember your history, more people were killed by flu after World War I than died in World War I. These are real challenges for us in the 21st century. And yet our traditional ways of thinking about power ignores the real way to deal with these. You can't solve any of the problems I just mentioned with military power. You're attacked by electrons, where do you send the cruise missile? There is a pandemic, what do? You sign that China is building one new coal-fired plant a week. And China is now the one area where it is a superpower. It's the superpower of CO2. How do you respond to that? You can't respond militarily. You can't bomb these Chinese plants. You can't respond economically. If you put tariffs against Chinese goods while China exploits its own sovereign coal resources, you'll mess up the world trading system. The only way you can respond is in a cooperative fashion. We have to help China, and China has to help us, to reduce the carbon intensity of growth. There is no solution other than working with others. In other words, as we think of power, we sometimes think of power over others, but remember my definition, power is the ability to get the outcomes you want. Sometimes you can only get those outcomes by working with others. And that whole realm of this bottom board of transnational relations, the only way we're going to get the outcomes we want is by organizing cooperation, by developing networks and institutions to deal with these issues. And that's going to require a much more refined and sophisticated understanding of what power is and how we use it. I'd like to tell you that we're on the verge of getting that understanding. I'm afraid that's premature. And that's why I've written this new book. But I hope that your generation will get it and will, what's more, do something about it. So thank you very much.